Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more. The discovery of TUTANKHAMUN'S tomb, 1922. The Valley of the Kings. Even now, a century later, the name stirs something in the blood. By 1922, it was a place known to archaeologists almost as intimately as the backs of their own weathered hands. A narrow desert valley carved into the Theban cliffs, bleached by the merciless Egyptian sun. Wind-scorched ridges and dry wadis, twisting like the bones of ancient beasts. The air smelled of dust and stone and deep time. It clung to your clothes. It dried the back of your throat. It got between your teeth. By late morning, the heat pressed down with such weight that even the cicadas seemed to give up their chatter, and yet under that crushing stillness there were whispers. Whispers of gold. Whispers of a king. Howard Carter stood at the edge of an excavation trench, staring at a patch of ground no one else thought worth digging. He was 48 years old, sun-hardened, and angular as the cliffs that loomed above him. A man who rarely smiled, even when fortune favoured him, which it had not for some years now. His eyes were pale and sharp, the kind that weighed a man or a ruin in a single glance. He'd been in Egypt for over 30 years, first as an artist, hired to sketch reliefs in ancient tombs. Later, as an excavator, trained under the legendary Flinders Petrie. He had dug in sand so fine it crept into his ears at night, chipped through rock until his hands bled, and endured the long agony of excavation seasons that yielded nothing. Most men in his position would have gone home, their dreams buried along with the empty tomb shafts. Carter stayed, because he was sure that somewhere beneath the valley floor lay the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose brief reign had flickered out more than 3,000 years ago. Most of his peers thought the idea was nonsense. Tutankhamun was a footnote in history, an afterthought to the great dynasties. His tomb, if it had ever existed, would have been plundered centuries ago, but Carter had spent years studying ancient workmen's huts, chisel marks and fragments of pottery. He'd mapped the valley like a general planning a siege. And he knew there was one small patch that had never been properly excavated, a triangle of rubble and debris at the foot of the tomb of Ramses VI. It was here or nowhere. The dig had started weeks before under a haze of frustration. His patron, the wealthy and eccentric Lord Carnarvon, had given him just one more season of funding. One last chance. Carnarvon had been a good friend to Carter, but friendship only went so far when expedition costs mounted year after year with nothing to show. If they failed again, the concession to dig in the valley would pass to someone else. The team was a mixture of seasoned Egyptian foremen, labourers from the villages along the Nile, and a few European assistants. Their tools were simple but effective: picks, shovels, trowels, wicker baskets for hauling spoil. The sound of excavation was a steady rhythm, the thunk of iron biting into packed soil, the scrape of shovels, the shuffle of bare feet carrying baskets up the slope. And the heat, always the heat. It rose from the ground in shimmering waves, burning the skin and sapping the will. The men worked with cloth twisted around their heads and shoulders, dark sweat stains spreading across their galabeas. Water jars were passed down the line, the clay cool against cracked lips. Day after day they cleared rubble, finding nothing. Just more stones, more dust, more exhaustion. Until the morning of the 4th of November, 1922. Hussein Abdel Rasoul was a boy from the nearby village, tasked with bringing water to the men. He was no archaeologist, but he had an eye for the ground. All Egyptians in the valley did. Balancing the water jars, he spotted the edge of something in the dirt. Not rock, not rubble, something straight. Cut. A step. He called out. Within minutes, Carter and the foreman were crouched in the dust, brushing away soil with their fingers, then with a soft-haired brush. Another step emerged, then another. It was a staircase cut deep into the bedrock, descending towards something hidden below. Carter's heartbeat quickened. This was not random. This was not chance. They dug carefully, each stone basketed away under the foreman's watch. The staircase went down and down until a flat wall of limestone and plaster stopped their progress. A wall with the faint, time-worn impression of an ancient seal. The jackal of Anubis over 9 bound captives, the mark of the necropolis guards. It was intact. That night, Carter wrote the words that would change his life. First step of tomb found. Possible sealed door, awaiting Carnarvon. He wired his patron in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. It would take more than 2 weeks for Carnarvon to arrive. 2 weeks of keeping the site sealed and guarded. 2 weeks of resisting the urge to go further. The valley was alive with rumour. Other archaeologists sniffed around the edges, trying to glean what had been found. Local villagers passed, whispered tales of the hidden stairway from one tea shop to another. Carter said nothing. Not yet. When Carnarvon finally reached Luxor on the 23rd of November, accompanied by his daughter Lady Evelyn, the air seemed to hum with anticipation. The next morning, under a pale dawn sky, they descended the staircase together. Their boots echoed on the stone steps, 16 in all, before they reached the sealed doorway. Carter paused, examining the plaster. It was faintly cracked at the edges. Perhaps ancient workmen had once repaired it after some minor intrusion, but the seal itself was unbroken. He turned to Carnarvon, who gave a tight nod. With a small chisel and mallet, Carter cut a narrow hole in the upper left corner. Dust trickled out, carrying with it the dry, faintly sweet scent of ages, resin, wood, something else he couldn't name. He lit a candle, shielding it from the draught with his hand, and peered inside. Behind him, Carnarvon asked quietly, "Can you see anything?" For a moment, Carter did not answer. His eyes adjusted to the gloom. Shapes began to emerge, strange shapes, shimmering in the flickering light. Finally, he said, almost under his breath, "Yes, wonderful things." They widened the hole enough to step through. It was not yet the burial chamber that lay deeper still, but an antechamber crammed from floor to ceiling with treasures. Golden couches shaped like animals from the underworld. Chariots inlaid with precious metals. Gilded chests sealed with ropes and clay seals. Ebony and ivory chairs. The walls seemed to close in, not from size, but from the sheer weight of history pressing down. Every object was shrouded in fine grey dust, as though it had been placed there yesterday and abandoned ever since. In the flicker of the candlelight, the gold gleamed as if alive. They did not linger. Carter was meticulous. He knew that to rush now would be to destroy the very thing they had sought for years. The doorway beyond, flanked by 2 life-sized statues of the king himself, black as obsidian with inlaid eyes that seemed to follow your every movement, was still sealed. He ordered the chamber closed again. Guards were posted day and night. Everything would be catalogued, measured, photographed. Not a single object would leave the valley without record. But even in that first glimpse, they knew. They had found what the world thought gone forever, the last resting place of the boy king, and the world beyond the cliffs was about to lose its mind. That night, as the camp quieted and the desert wind hissed through the wadi, Carter sat in his tent and wrote in his diary, "The find is beyond anything. a sight to leave one speechless. He was not a man given to flights of emotion, but this was something else entirely. It was as if time itself had bent, allowing him to step across centuries into another world. A world that had waited for him. The sun rose over the valley with its usual pitiless brilliance. But this day the light seemed sharper, cleaner, as though the desert knew what lay ahead. The sealed tomb waited. Stone, plaster, and darkness had kept its secrets for over 3,000 years. Now it was about to yield them. Carter, Carnarvon, and Lady Evelyn returned to the foot of the staircase. The workmen had been dismissed. Only a few trusted assistants remained, along with representatives from the Antiquities Service. There was no shouting, no ceremony, only a sense of gravity, the weight of history pressing down. The air in the corridor was already close. Dust hung in the half-light, like suspended breath. Every footstep seemed too loud, too sharp. Carter approached the doorway, flanked by the two black guardian statues. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their gold kilts gleaming faintly in the gloom, each holding a ceremonial staff and mace. Their inlaid quartz eyes fixed on the intruders without mercy or warmth, and behind them, the sealed second door. He knelt. The tools were simple: a mallet, a small chisel, a knife for prizing away fragments of plaster. No matter how many tombs he had entered before, Carter worked as though performing surgery. Every chip was deliberate, every pause calculated. The final layer crumbled away beneath his fingers. A gap opened, wide enough to admit his hand, then a candle. He leaned forward. The air was heavy, sweet, tinged with something like incense long extinguished. The flickering flame revealed the first impressions of a room beyond. Gold, gold everywhere, but not the flat, lifeless gleam of museum pieces. This gold was alive. It caught the light and flung it back in warm waves, wrapping every object in a kind of eternal dawn. Carter widened the hole and stepped through. The others followed in silence. The chamber beyond was chaos and splendour bound together, and the antechamber, golden couches in the forms of mythical beasts, their heads snarling or gazing serenely into eternity. Chariots dismantled and stacked in heaps, wheels and yokes wrapped in linen. Ivory chairs with legs carved like the haunches of lions, gilded chests sealed with cords and clay seals, each marked with the royal cartouche. It was as though the world of a pharaoh had been packed away for a long journey, hastily, without ceremony, but with unmeasured wealth. Some objects leaned at odd angles as if set down in a rush. Others lay neatly in ordered rows, but everything was coated with a grey-brown film of dust. 3,000 years without light, sound or breath. And now, after all that silence, the room was alive with whispers. Not from the dead, but from the living. Carnarvon stood just behind Carter, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. Lady Evelyn moved slowly among the treasures, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though afraid to disturb the air. At the far end of the chamber was another sealed doorway. Its plaster was stamped with a cartouche, the name of TUTANKHAMUN. Here, at last, was the threshold to the burial chamber, but Carter would not rush. Every item in the antechamber had to be catalogued and removed before they could proceed. It was a process that would take months, and so the door was left intact. The guardians kept their silent vigil, and the treasures waited under the lamps as one by one they were photographed, measured, and lifted away. The tools of the trade were as far from romanticised adventure as one could imagine. Soft brushes for clearing dust from fragile surfaces, padded trays for carrying objects up the narrow stair, cotton gloves to keep sweat and oils from the ancient gilding, Heavy cameras mounted on tripods, their lenses adjusted to capture every line in the fading plaster. And the work was slow, painfully slow. The valley sweltered in the noonday sun, while, underground, the heat turned close and stifling. Men stripped down to undershirts, sweat dripping from their chins onto the ancient stone. By evening, when the site was locked and the guards posted, the camp hummed with speculation. What would the burial chamber hold? Was the king himself still there? And, the question no one voiced aloud, had the tomb truly never been robbed? The newspapers had already seized on the discovery. Carnarvon's name appeared in headlines from London to New York. Howard Carter's terse, practical quotes were printed alongside wild speculation from journalists who had never set foot in Egypt. The public imagination was lit like dry kindling. Tutankhamun, a little-known ruler whose name had barely surfaced in Egyptology, was suddenly the most famous pharaoh in history. When the last treasures of the antechamber were removed, Carter and his team turned again to the sealed door. It was the 16th of February 1923, and the moment had arrived. The small company gathered: Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, a handful of senior Egyptian officials, and a photographer. The lamps burned low, casting long shadows against the stone. The air was hot and stale. Carter raised his chisel. The plaster broke away under the blade, and once again that dry, sweet breath of the tomb escaped into the corridor. He stepped through. The burial chamber was smaller than he'd imagined, but dominated by one monumental structure, a massive gilded shrine, its surface covered with hieroglyphs and protective spells. Its presence filled the room entirely, pressing against the walls, leaving only narrow walkways along the sides. The shrine was not a single box, but a series. 4 nested shrines, each smaller than the last, one inside the other like Russian dolls. Every panel was carved and inlaid, every corner reinforced with gold fittings. This was no mere coffin stand. It was a fortress for the dead. The chamber walls were painted in brilliant yellow ochre, scenes of the king in the afterlife. In one, Tutankhamun is welcomed by Osiris, god of the underworld. In another, he is embraced by his Ka, his spiritual double. The colours were still vibrant after 3 millennia, though the surface bore a faint, crystalline bloom from centuries of trapped moisture. It would take weeks to dismantle the shrines and reach what lay at their heart. But Carter's meticulous methods left nothing to chance. Every plank, every fastening, every painted surface was documented. The photographer, Harry Burton, captured the work with an artistry that still shapes our image of the find today. Sepia tones, perfect composition, the gleam of gold under shadowed vaults. The world beyond Egypt was ravenous for news. Papers printed breathless updates, alongside sketches of imagined treasures. In drawing rooms and railway carriages, in cafes and lecture halls, people spoke the name Tutankhamun with a mix of awe and superstition. And then, tragedy. On the 5th of April 1923, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo from blood poisoning, brought on by an infected mosquito bite. The press, already primed with tales of curses and supernatural vengeance, exploded. The New York Times ran the headline, "Carnarvon dies in Egypt, tomb opened weeks ago, curse of Pharaoh feared." Work continued, though the shadow of Carnarvon's absence was keenly felt. Without his patron's charm and influence, Carter's dealings with Egyptian officials grew more strained. But inside the chamber, the work was everything. Layer by layer, the nested shrines were dismantled. Each revealed another, smaller, more intricately decorated than the last. Finally, at the centre, lay the quartzite sarcophagus, pinkish stone carved with protective deities. Its lid alone weighed more than a ton. It took a team of men and a system of pulleys to lift it clear. Inside were 3 anthropoid coffins. The first, overlaid with beaten gold, and inlaid with glass and semi-precious stones. The second, similarly crafted, but finer, the details sharper, the colours deeper. And the third, solid gold. The golden coffin was breathtaking, its surface chased with delicate patterns, its features those of the young king himself. Over his brow the royal uraeus and vulture, symbols of divine authority. In his hands the crook and flail, emblems of kingship. Within, wrapped in linen and resin, lay the mummy of TUTANKHAMUN. Over his head and shoulders rested the funerary mask, the object that would become the single most recognized image of ancient Egypt. Gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian. The eyes calm, eternal, the mouth set in a faint, enigmatic smile. In that mask was the distilled essence of an empire, wealth, artistry, belief. A face meant to endure until the sun itself died. Carter stared at it for a long time before speaking. Even in the lamplight, the gold seemed to hold its own fire. This, he thought, was the culmination of his life's work. Years of dust, failure, and patience, all for this moment. But there were still questions. Why had such a king been buried in a relatively small tomb? Why were so many objects hastily arranged? And how had the tomb escaped the plunder that had gutted every other royal burial in the valley? Those mysteries would not be answered quickly. Some still remain unanswered today. What was certain was this: the discovery had changed archaeology forever. No other royal tomb had been found so complete, so untouched. It was a time capsule of the 18th dynasty at its zenith. Art, ritual, politics, and daily life preserved together. And it had given the modern world a story it could not resist. A boy king, dead too soon. A hidden tomb, a rediscovery that spanned millennia. And somewhere between truth and myth, the whisper of a curse. They called it the Pharaoh's Curse. The idea was as old as the first tomb robbers, that those who disturbed the eternal rest of Egypt's kings would pay for their crime in blood. But it was the death of Lord Carnarvon, just months after the tomb was opened, that brought the old superstition roaring back to life. A mosquito bite on his cheek became infected. Fever set in. On the night he died, it was said the lights went out across Cairo. And far away in England, his dog howled and dropped dead. It didn't matter that the story was embroidered in the telling. It was perfect for the newspapers. And they printed it in bold. Carter, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it all. There is no curse, he told reporters flatly. Only bad luck and worse timing. Then came more deaths. The American tycoon George J. Gould, who visited the tomb in 1923, dead weeks later from pneumonia. Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, shot dead by his wife in London the same year. Colonel Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's own half-brother, gone from blood poisoning not long after. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed the king's mummy, dead of an unexplained illness. Carter's secretary, Richard Bethel, found lifeless in his bed at a London club in 1929, the whispers saying, "smothered." And then Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, who threw himself from a window the following year, leaving a note that spoke of misfortune and despair. Each death, no matter how far removed in place or time, was seized upon as proof. Proof that Tutankhamun had stretched out a hand from beyond the grave. Proof that the intruders had been marked. It didn't matter that many who entered the tomb lived for decades afterwards. It didn't matter that Howard Carter himself, the man who breached the seal, who touched every treasure, who unwrapped the king, lived another 17 years. The legend had its own momentum now, and perhaps that was the point, because Egypt is a land that understands the power of a story. The ancients knew it, the priests knew it, the pharaohs knew it. Stories outlast armies, they outlast empires. And so the curse of the pharaoh became another treasure from the tomb, a relic made not of gold or lapis, but of whispers and shadow. A gift to the living, or perhaps a warning. Today we dismiss it as coincidence, as the work of chance and failing health in a world before penicillin. But when you stand in the cool stillness of TUTANKHAMUN'S burial chamber, when the painted eyes of the boy king watch you from the wall, you may feel, just for a moment, that the curse is real. For months after the golden mask was revealed, the tomb of Tutankhamun was the beating heart of the archaeological world. Scholars, officials, journalists, they all descended on the Valley of the Kings, each wanting a closer look at the boy king who had slumbered in darkness for over 3,000 years. Howard Carter moved through it all like a man, half in this world and half in another. He was still there in the valley at first light, and still there at dusk, brushing, measuring, recording. Every object, from the grandest shrine to the smallest ivory button, was treated with the same reverence. It was exhausting work, but Carter was uncompromising. His methods were slow, his standards absolute. This was not treasure hunting. It was preservation. The tomb was more than a burial. It was a complete royal household in miniature. There were weapons, finely made bows, quivers of arrows, throwing sticks inlaid with ivory. There were musical instruments, board games, jars of wine and beer, even baskets of dried fruit. Furniture for the afterlife, beds, chairs, tables, footstools, chariots, some clearly made for ceremonial display, others robust enough for the hunt. The craftsmanship was beyond compare. Gold leaf so thin it fluttered when touched. Stone carving so fine it seemed impossible that human hands had shaped it. And woven through it all, the smell. Not the sour reek of decay, but something richer, the lingering traces of cedar oil, incense, and the faint sweet dust of centuries. But the world outside the tomb was less serene. The relationship between Carter and the Egyptian Antiquities Service had grown strained. Nationalist sentiment was on the rise, and there was resentment toward the control foreigners, especially the British, held over Egypt's ancient heritage. Every decision about the tomb became political. Who could enter, when objects could be removed, where they would be housed? Carter found himself caught between the demands of science and the demands of sovereignty. At one point, a dispute with the authorities caused the site to be shut for months. The valley returned to silence, the sealed chambers once again under guard. When work resumed, Carter pushed on with renewed focus. By 1930, 8 years after that first step was uncovered, the excavation and documentation of the tomb was finally complete. Over 5,000 artifacts had been removed, restored, and catalogued. Every single one remained in Egypt. This was perhaps the greatest difference between the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and the fate of so many treasures before it. The Rosetta Stone, the Parthenon marbles, the treasures of Troy, all had been carried off to foreign museums. Tutankhamun would stay home. As for the boy himself, the mummy was examined and rewrapped. Early X-rays showed a break in one leg bone and a possible injury to the skull. Some speculated it was murder, others thought it a hunting accident or complications from a fall. In the decades since, CT scans and DNA analysis have painted a more complicated picture. A young man with congenital health issues, possibly from generations of inbreeding, a cleft palate, a club foot, and evidence of malaria. Not the heroic warrior king imagined by the ancient murals, but a fragile human figure. And yet he had been buried as a god. Outside of scholarly circles, none of this dulled the fascination. The treasures of the tomb went on display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and the queues stretched out the door. In the 1970s, selected objects, including the Golden Mask, travelled the world. Wherever they went, millions came. People who had never heard of the 18th dynasty stood for hours to glimpse the face of the boy king. Tutankhamun's image seeped into popular culture. Posters, jewellery, fashion, even films and comic books borrowed his likeness. Egyptomania had taken hold, and then there was the legend of the curse. No matter how often Carter denied it, no matter how many people connected to the excavation lived long, healthy lives, the idea refused to die. It was too perfect a story. A king's eternal rest disturbed, a warning ignored, and a string of misfortunes, some real, others invented, laid at the feet of supernatural vengeance. In the end, the curse became part of the tomb's mythos, a shadow that only heightened its allure. Carter himself never married, never took on another major excavation after Tutankhamun. He lived quietly in England, occasionally lecturing, always protecting the reputation of his find. He died in 1939 at the age of 64. At his funeral there were few mourners, but among them were Egyptian officials, a sign of the respect he had earned, despite the tensions, on his gravestone in Putney Vale. Cemetery is carved an Egyptian blessing. May your spirit live. May you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness. It might just as easily have been written for the boy king he uncovered. Today the tomb of Tutankhamun is still there in the Valley of the Kings. Visitors can descend the staircase Carter first uncovered, stand in the antechamber, and peer into the burial chamber where the boy king lies in a climate-controlled glass case. The murals on the walls are brighter now, carefully cleaned and preserved. The air is cooler, the space lit with subtle modern lamps. But when the crowd thins and the chamber falls quiet, you can still sense the weight of that first discovery. Still imagine the flicker of a candle, the quickened breath, the whispered words. Yes, wonderful things. In 2015, radar scans hinted at hidden voids beyond the walls of the tomb, perhaps even another burial. For a brief moment it seemed the valley might yield yet another secret. So far, nothing has been confirmed. And maybe that's as it should be, because the magic of Tutankhamun's tomb lies not only in what was found, but in the idea that there might always be more. For the archaeologists, the lesson of 1922 was clear. Patience, discipline, and respect could achieve what centuries of looting and guesswork never had. For the rest of us, it was something more personal. It was a reminder that even in a world mapped, measured, and photographed from the sky, there are still hidden doors, still wonders waiting beneath the dust. And sometimes those wonders are not the grandest or most famous kings, but the forgotten ones. The overlooked names on a crumbling list. The quiet, unassuming figure who, against all odds, becomes the one we remember most. Tutankhamun was no Ramses the Great. He didn't conquer empires or build towering monuments. His reign was short, his power likely controlled by others. But in death he achieved what few in history ever have. He captured the imagination of the entire world, and in that, perhaps, he won the only immortality worth having. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.